and welcome to everybody wherever you are in the world. We've got participants from all over the world today, and I can only say I hope the weather's better where you are than it is here in Croydon. Today we're just going to go through a few slides and a few discussions about auto-enrolment, looking at some of the options available, what people should be looking at doing at this stage in the auto-enrolment process. We've got three speakers here. Myself, I'm John Reeve, Head of Consulting at Premier.
I'm Kirsten Back-Peterson, Senior Consultant at Premier.
And Martin Thompson, Director at Premier.
And all of us are working with a number of clients on auto-enrolment at the moment. So we're going to take you through the process that we've been adopting with those clients. We've found as we've taken clients through this that a five-stage approach has worked quite well. And we've got here the five different stages of an auto-enrolment project. The intention today is to go through each of those five stages really as an agenda and give you some guidance and some background of what we've been talking to clients about, and a case study of a specific case that we've taken through this process. This is the third of a series of webinars we've been carrying out, and you can see those details on the slide there of the other two that we've done, which are on the WTG website if you'd like to go and look at a bit more detail from the past. So what we want to do today really is go through this process. And we'd like to start by finding a bit about from yourselves where you are in your auto-enrolment process. And if you could, on this poll, click on the appropriate button to show where you are down the list in your process. So are you just about to start? You've got a project team in place, and you've got a plan in place. You've decided on your strategy and you're well in the process of deciding on the contribution design. You've got all your providers in place, or maybe you've got as far as doing all of that and done your communication, or you're up and running. If you could just click on the appropriate button where you are in that process down on the right-hand side, give us a feel for what your views are. While that's going on, just to give you some background, we've had 4 or 5 questions from people regarding the process of auto-enrolment, and a few real detailed questions which we hope to cover as we go along. And so we'll pick those up. And one particular one from Harry was around what the impact of auto-enrolment on small and medium companies is going to be. And I hope by the end of today you'll get a good feel for what the impact is going to be on small companies and medium-sized companies. So I think our survey is nearly ready, with a bit of luck. See what results we get, and that'll help us. We'll try and tailor the discussion we have to where you all are in your process when this comes up. Okay, so that's useful. I think if we found that everybody was right at the end and had done everything, then we might just get our coats and leave now. But thank you for that. So it looks like most of our people are at the start of this process, and hopefully we can give you some ideas as to move forward. Yeah, a number of you have yet to start, so hopefully we can make sure we start you off in the right direction. So thank you for that. So what we want to start by doing is just moving on to the next slide. We'll start by looking at project initiation. Kirsten, you've taken a number of clients through this process, through the stages that we've identified. What are the key aspects of the project initiation that you think that people should be looking to include?
Thank you, John. I mean, initially, the first thing is making sure that you identify all the key stakeholders that need to be involved in the process and getting them on board. And typically what we're looking at here is representatives from HR, finance, payroll, and if you do have a pensions department, obviously the pensions department as well. Once we've got the project team in place, then we need to sort of clearly define the roles and responsibilities within that team. And that may well mean that some people are involved all of the time, other people are just involved at certain stages within the process, and it's important to get that clear at the outset. We've found working with clients that sort of preparing and complying with auto-enrolment is to a very large extent a sort of a process that you need to go through, albeit a very detailed process with a number of different work streams going on. So we've found that putting in place a project plan is a very effective way of making sure that you actually tick all the boxes that need to be ticked as you go through that process. We've actually used an online project management software for this purpose, and the good thing about using that is it can be accessed by all of the members of the project team if required, and updated by them as well. So it's a really good way of keeping everybody up to date with what's happening, especially if people are based in different locations and it's hard to pull people together for meetings. And I have to say that we find that this is the most effective and efficient way of making sure that the auto-enrolment project runs smoothly. It really is a complex sort of area, as we can see if we move on to the next slide. So you can see from the project plan we've got there, we don't expect any of you to be able to read that, but I think it shows you the extent of the number of actions that need to be gone through. But as I say, a very good way of making sure you stay on track.
Okay, thanks. Kirsten's emphasised there the importance of actually a project plan, and if any of you would like us to draw up a tailored project plan for yourselves, and if you get in touch with us, either at the email address shown there or through the feedback form at the end of this webinar, we'll provide you with a tailored project plan, a quick chat about some of your key dates, and we can help you put together that high-level plan. We'll be happy to do that for you. So I want to move on now to just looking a bit more at the strategy. And Martin, there are a number of different ways in which employers can meet their responsibilities, and that will depend on what the employer is trying to achieve. How are you helping clients look at their strategy and decide on their pension solution?
Okay, thank you, John. Well, just following on from what Kirsten said about the importance of a project plan, I think it's important that the key stakeholders are involved in an early stage in a strategy discussion. So what we typically recommend is we get everyone around the table and we really look at the issues that you can see on the slide now. So a good example of that is, what are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to achieve cost minimisation? Are we trying to encourage people into pensions? And it's really important to get those sort of high-level issues sorted out very early on. I think as well, ultimately, for a lot of employers, this is an additional cost for them at a difficult time. So it's really important that obviously the cost implications are fully understood, because as John touched upon, there are various ways that you can comply with the legislation. It's important that you've looked at all of the options and considered them properly. So probably the best way to sort of illustrate this is through a case study, and this is based upon a live example. Obviously the name is anonymous, but the figures are broadly the same. And this is an organisation that has 2,000 workers, and workers is a term that's used in the auto-enrolment regulations, and it's not just your employees. It could also include people like contractors who work solely for you, so it's quite important that you establish early on who your workers are. In this particular scenario, they've got 2,000 workers, 300 of them are part-time, 760 of them even are in a group personal pension plan with a major insurance provider. 40 of them are in a separate stakeholder pension. This was a business that was acquired fairly recently. And we've got 200 people that are in a closed final salary plan. So not an untypical scenario. So that means that they've got 1,000 workers that aren't in any scheme at the moment, and we've done the analysis to assess, what category they come under. And I'll just cover this very quickly. An eligible job holder is effectively someone aged between 22 and state pension age, earning over for next tax year £9,440. So they've got 675 of those. They've then got 275 non-eligible job holders. So that's people that are outside of those age ranges, earning over £5,668. And then they've got another 50, what's the term is called entitled workers, and those are people that are earning less than £5,668 for next tax year. So again, a real cross-section, fairly typical scenario. Now, in terms of objectives, the objective of the HR director, which is fairly common again, was to keep things fairly simple. So ideally, would you like to use the current group personal pension plan using its current pension scheme design, which is a design where the employee pays 5% and the employer matches that 5%. Contributions are based on basic salary, again, not untypical. But in the strategy meeting, unsurprisingly, the finance director raised concerns about the cost of potentially putting 1,000 people into the pension scheme and what that would look like. So, in terms of options, just flicking over to the next slide, what we've done here is we've just sort of illustrated a few of the options. There are obviously numerous options that can be considered. But the way that the auto-enrolment regulations work is that you need to get to a combined contribution of 8% of salary or qualifying earnings, and I'll talk about that in a moment, by the time you get to October 2018. But there is a period of phasing that takes place in the run-up to that, so you don't have to do the full 8% on day one, you can phase it over a period of time. So what we've done here is we've looked at some different scenarios. This company's staging date is the 1st of August. And they're actually postponing auto-enrolment, which means that they're not going to start the process of auto-enrolling people for 3 months. So the costs will actually kick in from November 2013, which is why we've got November 2013 in the box here, which I'm just highlighting. So, looking at the costs based upon the current design, so this is where the employer puts in 5% of basic salary. We've made some assumptions on the bottom here, which I'll talk about in a moment. But essentially, the cost throughout each of the three phases is just under £600,000 a year. Okay, so, and that's just looking at auto-enrolling the 675 eligible job holders. So the finance director winced when he saw the figures, and we basically said, let's look at some other options in terms of gently phasing these costs in. So what we've looked at in the second scenario is essentially maintaining this one-for-one matching principle. So if the employee puts in 1%, the employer puts in 1%. Again, maintaining basic salary is the definition, and essentially looking at the first tier, which is a 1% employee, 1% employer contribution, getting to the required minimum of 2%. And the cost there, 116,000. Moving forward to October 2017, we need to get to a combined contribution of 5%. And here again, maintaining the one-for-one principle, we've got a 2.5% contribution. So the costs step up to 291,000. And in the last phase, we're getting to the 8%, which is 4 and 4, obviously, up to 465,000 cost. So as you can see, considerable cost differences here. And the other option that we looked at was what's the absolute minimum cost of compliance. So if we wanted to comply just on the minimum required by legislation, as you can see, we've got the statutory minimums here, which will be based on something called qualifying earnings. And qualifying earnings are defined down the bottom here, which is basically your total earnings banded between £5,668 and £41,450 for next tax year. So essentially your costs under this scenario are less, primarily because you're effectively not pensioning the first £5,668 of someone's earnings, and you're also capping it at the top end as well. Okay, so as you can see, a real sort of cross-section of options there, with some real sort of cost implications around them. So it's really important that this sort of part of the process is looked at in detail. Just a couple of assumptions that we've built into here. Number one is that we're assuming here 25% of the employees will opt out. Now that's the DWP's original estimate. What we're starting to see from some of the large employers, for example, Asda have just sort of published their figures. They're obviously one of the early stages. They're looking at an opt-out rate of around about 8%. So, I think it's really important that you consider very carefully what your maximum cost could be, because perhaps your opt-outs will be less than you anticipated. The other point I'd just like to make here is that effectively we're assuming here that people will be auto-enrolled on a salary sacrifice basis to generate national insurance savings. And that does have a significant impact, and is something that we'd certainly recommend that employers look at as part of their strategy discussions. And very finally on this slide, essentially a lot of pension schemes, they provide higher life assurance cover for pension scheme members than they do for other employees. So don't forget about costing in those additional costs of things like extra life cover as well. So hopefully gives you a very good snapshot of some of the options. Obviously there's just one of a range of scenarios, but hopefully it does sort of focus the mind a bit on the importance of having that strategy discussion and deciding what you do early on. Just finally on this point, just for the case study, the company decided to go with our middle option here, which is a fairly sensible option. They'd also decided to give people the voluntary option, if they want to increase to the 5%. So if employees can fill in an application form, they can still go into the 5 and 5 category, but they're only enrolling them at less than that. But as you'll see when Kirsten speaks a little bit later, that did raise some other issues as we sort of move through the process in terms of providers.
Okay, thanks Martin. Hopefully everybody can see that this is a fundamental part of the auto-enrolment journey that we outlined at the start. Having looked at your initial project implementation, the discussion around the costs and the strategy you want to adopt are really important, and it's important to get all the stakeholders involved in that, because you can see by the numbers, just almost comparing the top line and the bottom line, how the finance and the HR people may have a completely different view. And these aren't trivial amounts for most companies. It's also just worth thinking about the effect on your employees, because if you were to say that we're going to stick to 5 and 5 at the moment, that would mean that some employees wouldn't be able to afford to join, so your opt-out rate is likely to be higher than if you are given the option to be at 1 and 1 at the moment. So that can have an effect on the opt-out rates and things like salary review discussions and so on in the next few years, and you can see how those contributions are going up year on year. So just moving on then from strategy, we've looked at the implementation, we've looked at the strategy. The next stage really is to look at planning the solution. How do we actually deliver this? And Kirsten, you've worked with a number of clients on this, and we've got the strategy. You now need to plan to deliver this. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding out there about what payroll providers can do, what the pension providers are able to do. So how are you working with clients to plan the delivery of their strategy?
Yeah, thanks very much, John. As you mentioned, as sort of auto-enrolment drew closer and the larger companies started to reach their staging dates, there was certainly a belief that payroll providers should be able to supply the sort of software that you'd need to support you for auto-enrolment compliance. However, typically what we're finding is that this isn't generally the case, and that those that do have systems in place, the systems can't deal with all the aspects that we need them to in terms of compliance. And here we're talking about things like assessing the workforce, running calculations, dealing with the communication flows, which Martin's going to talk about later on, managing opt-outs, dealing with postponement, and so on. So in terms of planning, when we're looking at planning, we're really looking at these things we've got on the slide at the moment, those elements. And there's probably three main areas to consider here. First one being the impact on sort of HR and payroll. The second one, looking at the capability of the payroll providers, and then also looking at the capability of the pension providers to assist in compliance. So if we relate this back to the case study, if we look first of all at the HR and payroll issues that came out of this, Martin talked earlier about the classification of workers. And for this particular client, they did actually have to seek some legal input on this because, as we're finding with a lot of our clients, this can be far from clear. Unless everyone's sort of employed on a very clean employment contract, there's often some questions over certain individuals. The other area that they needed to look at was making changes to their contracts of employment in order to deal with auto-enrolling people on a salary sacrifice basis. And as we've said, sort of using salary sacrifice can create some very good cost savings for the company, so it's certainly something worth looking at. Continuing on looking at these planning issues, when we looked at the payroll provider system, they were developing something, but unfortunately it wasn't going to be ready in time, it wasn't going to be fully tested in time. Furthermore, we've actually put together a questionnaire that we put to payroll providers about their auto-enrolment software, and in this particular case they were only able to answer 23 of the 45 questions that we posed to them. We're going to look at that in a bit more detail later on. In terms of the provider review, and again Martin touched on this earlier, because the client was wanting to introduce a lower tier of contributions, their initial stance was that they would have to increase the management charges on the scheme for this particular reason. However, through our intervention, we did manage to get them to honour the charges that were currently in place. But it is really important to bear this in mind, because whether you're actually changing the contributions structure or not, or just putting into the scheme far more employees perhaps on lower earnings, pension providers can look at changing the charging structure. And hopefully this picks up on a question that we received in from Russell around this particular area. So having looked at the provider side of things, we also looked at their auto-enrolment software. The problem here was that it couldn't look at the multiple schemes and payrolls that we have in this particular case study. So again, that's something to be aware of. Lots of providers, pension providers' auto-enrolment software does focus very much on their own scheme and their own scheme only. We did also, for completeness, look at master trust arrangements, and John will talk a bit more about this in a moment, but these were discounted by the client as they felt that they didn't offer enough control in such areas as perhaps investment.
Okay, thank you very much. Martin, there's questions come in about expats and involvement in auto-enrolment. Can you give some information about that?
Yeah, I mean, effectively, it's a good question through from Russell, and it's one that, there's been a lot of uncertainty around what the answer is to this one, but essentially, we are looking at just UK ordinarily resident people that are paying UK tax, so expats typically wouldn't fall within that category, and therefore, they won't need to be auto-enrolled.
Right, okay, thank you for that. But it sounds like this might be an area where we might need some legal advice, as you were saying, Kirsten, in regards to the case study, that you need to make sure from your lawyers that
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that the regulators in setting up the rules for this have massively underestimated the complexity of the relationship between UK PLC and its employees, and frankly you can't make up the kind of things that we've come across in this. There was a separate question came in from Suzanne earlier around dealing with casual workers, people that might do 37 hours one week and 2 hours the next week, and how that would work. Kirsten, can you give any background to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of ways of managing that. So you're trying to ensure that you don't put people in who would only be in the scheme perhaps for 1 month, and then making sure that you're not deducting contributions from incredibly low earnings. And I think what you're looking at here is using a combination of postponement, which is where you can delay auto-enrolling people for up to a 3-month period, and this can allow for sort of spikes in earnings. So someone may qualify in 1 month, but they wouldn't qualify in the subsequent months, and therefore wouldn't have to be put in. And also, if you are sort of enrolling people on a qualifying earnings basis, because you discount the first £5,668 of their earnings, if people do then drop down to very low earnings, say a couple of hours a week, then there wouldn't be any contributions to deduct in the first place. So it is sort of probably very specific solutions for specific companies, but there are certainly ways of managing that and minimising the impact.
And it might come back to some of the things that Martin was saying about how you define your salary.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
I think that's important.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Kirsten finished off with, on the slide talking about master trusts a little bit, and talking about the fact that the master trust wasn't seen as an appropriate tool for this case study just because of the inflexibility and the fixed nature of them. And master trusts such as Nest and Now and People's Pensions have got a lot of publicity at the moment. And it's interesting that we're seeing people seeing that in 2 different ways. One, in terms of the fixed nature of it makes the decision making easier. The trustees of the master trust make all the decisions, so we don't have to worry about it as an employer. And the other one being that master trusts are actually quite restrictive. I think it'd be interesting to find out from yourselves. We've got a poll here that hopefully we can put up, looking at what your views are on master trusts. Do you think that the lack of flexibility offered by master trusts is a good thing, makes implementation of communication easier and makes the employer's life easier? Do you think it's a bad thing, as one master trust can't possibly be appropriate for all of the different types of employees we've talked about? Or is this something that you think you need more information about, and that the market needs to perhaps explain a bit better to HR professionals like yourselves? So if you could just give us a vote on that, that would be really, really helpful. While we're doing that, we've had a few questions coming in, as I say. One of them on the benefits of contractual auto-enrolment. Is that something, Martin, you could say a couple of words about?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Just to explain, contractual enrolment is another way of effectively complying with the legislation. So auto-enrolment is something that is written under statutes. In other words, it's law, so you have to do it, basically. Contractual enrolment is where you enrol people via their contracts of employment. The main advantage of contractual enrolment would be if you wanted to enrol everybody, all employees within the workforce. So you didn't want to have to assess eligible job holders, non-eligible job holders, etc., and you want to treat everyone the same. And it can also simplify the communication process as well. However, clearly that does then mean that you are enrolling everybody. You may have to make changes to people's contracts of employment to facilitate that, and it's probably the most costly option as well. So it's one that certainly can simplify, but generally speaking, simplification comes at a cost. So it's a matter of assessing really, what you're trying to achieve. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, thanks. So the poll, we've got the poll results up there, which is quite interesting and probably reflects the first poll, in that most people are at the start of this process and starting to think about their strategy. So it's something that people need to understand a bit more about master trusts, and I think this is something we're coming across as well. Nest has done a lot of advertising to individuals about auto-enrolment and how important it is, but the actual mechanics of Nest and Now and People's Pension are something that people need to understand from an HR perspective, but also from the employees, and understanding how it works from that point of view. So hopefully we'll see the industry rising to that challenge over the next few months, and certainly we'll be talking to our clients a lot more about those aspects. So we're now going to move on our journey to auto-enrolment, looking at the communication side. And Martin, it seems to me that the processes we've described are horribly complicated, but once you've made your decisions, they can be achieved with some good tools, some good project management. You can get there. The thing I think a lot of people are struggling with is the enormous amount of communication that you need to make with your employees, and trying to engage with employees who, frankly, hadn't shown a history of being particularly interested in pensions, something which is very complicated. So what are you doing with clients to help the communications process?
Okay, well, thanks, John. Again, it boils down to what are the objectives of the employer, and we sort of put up some of the sort of thought processes here. So there's certain mandatory things that you have to do, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But it's more about what are you actually trying to achieve from your scheme. Are you looking to promote a current arrangement? And quite a lot of employers are looking at doing that ahead of auto-enrolment. So you may have a population that haven't chosen to join a scheme for whatever reason, most likely apathy, I would suggest. They just don't get round to it. So you may want to do a bit of a campaign on sort of raising the awareness before you're sort of forced to put them in, because I think people generally value something more if they buy it themselves rather than if you sort of give it to them. So I think that's an important consideration. I think as well, it's important that, looking back to our previous case study slide, this could be costing our employer £500,000. You want to make sure that people appreciate it. So it's really important to get that aspect of communication right as well. So just looking through on the next slide, just coming up now. What do you have to do? And we're basically working this back again to our case study. So essentially, we're starting from 1st of April as the sort of launch of our communication campaign. The employer's staging date is the 1st of August 2013. They're applying postponements, so they're not actually starting to auto-enrol employees for 3 months. So the actual enrolment date is the 1st of November 2013. And essentially, they've got a period of time that they can opt out, which is 30 days from when they're enrolled or they receive their communications, whichever is later. So you've got a period of activity taking place here. So what you have to do, well, in this scenario, because they're using postponement, you're going to need to issue a communication to eligible job holders telling them they're going to be postponed. You also need to issue notices to your non-eligible job holders and your entitled workers, and also members of current pension schemes, telling them that they're effectively in a qualifying pension scheme and therefore they won't be auto-enrolled. So it's a pretty big task here, effectively involving 2,000 communications in this particular employer's case. Now again, there's different ways that you can structure these communications. You can have a general notice that covers all employees, or you can have what's termed tailored notices, so they're very focused on that individual's particular circumstances. It's important to work that out. Moving forward, at the end of the postponement period, you then have to issue them with an enrolment notice. So the eligible job holders that are being put into the scheme, you have to issue that to them. Now, if you're with the right pension provider, you may find that your pension provider will do that for you, which again saves you potentially issuing 700 odd letters at that particular point in time. And lastly, the final communication is a welcome from the provider, typically at the end of the opt-out period. So that's what you must do. I'm just flicking over the page in terms of what you may want to do and what we tend to recommend. Firstly, starting off with some form of warm-up communication. And this is really, I would suggest, once you've got your strategy organised and you know how you're going to put people in and what scheme you're going to put them in, it makes sense to tell them. Now that warm-up notice can serve a couple of purposes. One, it can remind them that they have a scheme that they can join on day one if you're trying to encourage take-up of the particular scheme. In another scenario, I've seen it used to close off an existing scheme. So to say you've got one final opportunity to join a current scheme, otherwise you're going to be put into a new arrangement going forward from auto-enrolment. And also it can be served as your contractual change for introducing salary sacrifice. So there's a whole host of reasons why you might want to do some warm-up communications. As we get into the sort of staging period or your postponement period here, it's all about engaging with staff and making sure they understand what's going to happen to them. Now we've seen a few examples already of what I would call good communication, which is where the HR team has had very light contacts and queries from members during the enrolment and opt-out period. And we've had some other examples where the HR and payroll team have been inundated with queries from staff because they don't understand what's happening. I hasten to say none of those are our clients, our clients all fit in the former category. But essentially I think it's really important that people understand what's happening. So sort of things you can do there are things like poster campaigns or intranet campaigns, a sort of countdown type campaigns, so perhaps something going out saying auto-enrolment's coming, this is what it means, followed up by a secondary message saying we're now going to postpone you and you'll be receiving a notice at your home which explains what that is. And finally, we're going to auto-enroll you this month because we've now reached the end of our auto-enrolment period. So very clearly people are aware of what's happening. You can back that up with presentations and webinars as well. So that really covers the sort of engagement aspects. And finally, your key activity period is going to be around this period here, around enrolment and the opt-out window. What we strongly recommend here is that you make sure that you've got telephone and email support in place to field the queries. I still think a lot of members aren't really going to appreciate auto-enrolment until they see it on their payslip. So if you have a facility on your payslip to put a notice, that would make sense. It might also make sense to put your pension provider's telephone number on there as well, although they won't thank me for saying that, to sort of field the queries for you. So again, lots of things to think about around communication. Again, it comes back to the strategy discussion. What are you trying to achieve? And really building your communication plan off the back of that.
Thanks, Martin. I think it's key to look at what you're trying to achieve, because we expect that, and making sure you've got the facilities to deal with the queries coming back, because as Martin says, we expect that no matter how much communication you put in, it's not until people get that pay slip with that deduction in that they're really going to focus on this. They're going to think that pensions aren't for them, it's not an issue for them, so they're going to ignore the communication. But when they get that pay slip with even 1 or 2% deducted, they're going to be knocking on the HR or the payroll's door. So having the resources to deal with those queries is going to be key. Kirsten, do you see people looking at this kind of communication as an opportunity to widen the communication from just pensions? I know some of the things that Morrison's did, for example, was very much around more savings-orientated communications. Do you see people using this as an opportunity to widen the communication?
Yeah, I think it certainly is. You know, an opportunity, as Martin said, to sort of communicate more about existing arrangements before changes are made, for one thing, but also just to try and raise financial awareness generally amongst employees. It really does, again, come back to what it is that they're trying to achieve and how much they want to put into this for their employees.
And is there room here? Is there a place here for more electronic communication?
I think so, definitely. I think, you know, as much as electronic communications can be used where appropriate, it's a really good thing. But again, you were saying earlier how complex the makeup of a workforce is. We're often finding situations where we have one proportion of the workforce who are on email within the organisation, others who are perhaps working on a shop floor, within a factory, whatever. So I think it needs to be what's appropriate for the people concerned. But certainly I think using electronic means where possible is a good way of dealing with this raft of communication that needs to go out.
I mean, I think it's crucial that you have a separate communications part in your project plan. I think it's a vital part of this. And even if you're in the situation where you want to do the minimum amount of communication, the regulations are such that you have to do certain things, and that is going to confuse your employees and you're going to get questions. So I think the communications element of this project is as important as all the other ones, really. Okay, so we want to move on now to implementation. A lot of the early implementers of auto-enrolment have been the really big companies. We've talked about Morrison's, and Martin talked about Asda recently as well. They've been able to set up their own processes, and a lot of them have designed their own systems to do this. Kirsten, what are the tools that are available for the next phase of auto-enrolment for the smaller companies? Linda asked a question for us of what tools are available in the market to help people now towards auto-enrolment. So which ones were looked at from the case study to look at this?
Yeah, as you say, I think reverting this back to the case study is a really good way of looking at what's available out there. And really the main concern with the case study was making sure that there was a system in place to administer auto-enrolment, and moreover that system was doing as much of the work as it possibly could. So if we just go on to look at the next slide and we can recap on the options that were considered. And as I say, this relates to the case study, but I think we can look at them in general terms as well. So first of all, looking at the payroll provider side of things, they were building a system, but it wasn't going to be tested in time. It was going to be able to manage the assessment process, but not the communications. So although this could have helped sort of in managing auto-enrolment for the client, it would have required a lot of additional resource in terms of some sort of manual method of sending out all of those communications, which, you know, as we've said, is not a task to be underestimated, so best avoid it if you can. The other point with the payroll provider software was that it wasn't particularly user-friendly. It was somewhat Excel-based and therefore rather clunky to navigate around again, so again, not ideal. You need to think here about who's going to be using the software, and therefore it needs to be as user-friendly as it can be. And also, we needed to have something that could deal with two different payrolls and different providers. And again, this payroll provider system was very much geared to dealing with their payroll alone, so again, that wasn't going to work. The next thing we looked at in this case study was the group personal pension plan provider. So again, pension providers are a good source of support for auto-enrolment. And in this particular case, they did offer a free solution. Now, obviously, main advantage of that being that it's free, but free is only any good if it actually does what you need it to do. And unfortunately here it could only deal with its own pension scheme and also with Nest, one of the master trust arrangements we mentioned earlier. And if we think back to the case study, we were looking here at a situation where they had a defined benefit scheme, a group personal pension and a group stakeholder arrangement. So again, this couldn't work. So having explored those two possibilities, which we would always suggest people do, and it's indeed what we do with our clients, we then looked at what are termed hub solutions. And hub solutions are really what we call provider-agnostic systems, where they can deal with any number of payrolls, any number of pension schemes, aren't connected to any specific company in any way. There's a number of these out here. We have one ourselves called PAM, which Martin is going to demonstrate to us shortly. In terms of implementing the hub solution, which was the way that the client here in the study did go, there are some costs associated with this, but because of the savings sort of generated through the time efficiency of the system, and also the fact that we helped them implement salary sacrifice, which generated a great deal of savings for the company, these were offset, and therefore this sort of achieved the objectives of the client. If we just move on to the next slide, just looking really sort of a bit more at the process of implementation and administration of auto-enrolment, and don't worry, I'm not going to talk through this in any detail whatsoever, but this really just shows the assessment processes that you have to go through in every single pay period for auto-enrolment. And if we look at the next slide here, the area that's actually sort of coloured in sort of reddy pink there shows typically what payroll providers are able to cover within that sequence, and indeed that was the case with our particular client. So if you look at that, you can see there's a big chunk of the work there that isn't perhaps covered by the payroll systems, and this is really why these middleware type solutions are becoming increasingly popular and also very necessary in terms of managing auto-enrolment.
Okay, thanks for that. In fact, interesting questions come in from Donna asking if there's a template available for the kind of questions to ask a payroll provider, and certainly we've got a template that we can help you with. So again, if anybody's interested in talking to us about the questions you need to ask your payroll provider, either put something in the feedback form at the end of the webinar or contact us on the contact details, and we'll be happy to take you through that questionnaire and help you ask your payroll providers the key questions. So I think it's a really good question from Donna. I think it's something that's really important. Talk to your payroll providers, not only about what they can do, but really trying to understand what they're not going to be doing, because they'll say, yes, we'll be able to do it. The definition of it in that statement is something that's pretty key to working out what it is you need from them. So I think that's helpful. Martin, Linda asked a question about tools, and Kirsten's talked about the auto-enrolment process. We've got a system here, a middleware system, and you're going to just take us through a quick demonstration of that. So hopefully with Technology Works, we're just going to share Martin's screen so he can make sure you can all see this, which is an online demonstration of a system used to administer all of the auto-enrolment process. Martin.
Okay, thank you, John. As we sort of touched upon in the last section, we sort of recognised over a year ago now that a lot of the payroll companies were going to only be able to provide limited support to our clients, so we felt that we needed a solution. So essentially, one of the issues with auto-enrolment is where does it best sit within the organisation? Does it sit best within payroll? Does it sit within pensions? Is it within HR? And quite often we find it's a bit of a hot potato in that no one really wants to take ownership of it. So technology can really help you through those issues. And whether it's this solution or provider solutions, some of which are very good, or payroll solutions, it's important that you think about how you're going to administer it. So I'm just going to take you through a quick sort of tour of our system, PAM, Premier Auto-Enrolment Manager, and just sort of explain how it works and what it does. I'm not going to go into the detail. If any of you'd like a sort of separate, more detailed demonstration, again, please do come back to us as part of the feedback, and we'll be happy to arrange that with you and relate it to your own situation. But just to show you quickly through the system starts with configuration. So you will build your structure within the system, and what we're looking at here is two elements really. One is the pension schemes that you have, and secondly is the payrolls that you'll be importing into the system. So the way these systems typically work is that each pay period, so whether it's weekly, monthly, whatever your pay period, you would upload a payroll file into the system. The system would then validate it against various checks, and would then give you various actions to fulfill, and then you would export any changes out of the system back into payroll, hence the term middleware. So, starting off, setting up your pension schemes. Essentially, you go in, you put in your staging date, you put in your pension scheme, the name, and the basic information. You can add categories to that scheme. So, for example, if you've got a separate category for sales than you've got for executives or other groups, you basically go in and you configure the rule sets around this. So you put in the contributions that you'll pay, what your pay reference periods are for that organisation, and just to be clear, the pay reference period is the period that you're contractually paying people for. So normally it will be a calendar month, possibly starting from the first of the month to the last day of the month, but again, it's something to check. So you go through and you would set up each of your groups. We've got another one here for marketing, and you could add other groups. So basically, this is a one-time process to complete that setup. And you would go through and you would do that if you added in extra schemes. So, for example, if you had your main scheme where you applied to sales and you had 1 month postponement, you had your marketing function that maybe had 2 months postponement. All sorts of different configurations can be structured. You've then perhaps got long-term contractors that you're going to put into Nest, simply because they're not going to be with you, in the long term because of the nature of their employment. And then maybe you've got another pension scheme as well. And you can continue building schemes and building groups within schemes for whatever level of complexity you have. So once you've done that, you're halfway through the process. We're now into the second part of the process, which is payroll mapping. And as Kirsten touched upon earlier, quite often it's not uncommon to have more than one payroll. It could be you've acquired someone, they're still on an old payroll. So again, payroll mapping's key. So essentially, all of the data is based around CSV files. So as long as your payroll system can extract a CSV file with certain information, effectively the system will work with it. And again, you can choose different groups that your payroll file will cover, or you could just have one payroll file covering the whole group. You would then go through a process of mapping your data fields. So what this is doing is saying these are the fields that the system needs, and these are the columns or references on your CSV file where those fields can be found. And again, we've got our number formats here. So pretty much any number format that comes out of your payroll, again, can be accommodated within the system. So what you're doing here is telling the system how to read your file each month. Okay, and essentially there's a check at the bottom. You would then go through and identify if you've got different mappings for different divisions or different schemes. Again, you could build those. Hopefully, in most cases, it'll be fairly simple. You'll have one mapping and one payroll. But essentially, the complexity of the system enables you to sort of cope with all of these different areas here. Okay, so essentially, you've gone through, you've set up your structure within the system, and as I say, that's a one-time process. In this particular example, we've got 940 employees in the scheme, 3 different pension schemes, 4 different groups, and as you can see here, it's done your assessment already of who are your eligible job holders, non-eligibles, and entitled workers. So once you're happy with that, you submit the setup, and that's done within the system. Okay. The second thing that the system can do, which I'm not going to go through today, is help with certification. So if you are looking to use a basic salary definition instead of qualifying earnings, you'll need to certify to the pensions regulator that you comply with the regulations. And this self-certification tool within the system actually does that for you. So what it does is it checks against the rule sets, checks against what the pensions regulator says, and at the end of the process gives you a certificate that you can submit to the regulator if asked. So again, it's a fairly unique bit of kit that deals with that aspect for you. I now want to sort of really move on to the compliance check, because this is the most important part of the system, because this is what you'll be doing every pay reference period. So essentially what you would do each month, or if you're on a monthly payroll, weekly if it's weekly payroll, you would go into the system, and it's very intuitive. There's lots of sort of help buttons over here as well, but you basically upload the last payroll file for each of your different categories. You would then work through, and the system would then do the checks in the background, and this takes a matter of seconds. So what it's doing is basically comparing your payroll file this month against your payroll file last month, and it's coming back to you and telling you what all of the actions are that you need to complete for that particular scheme and that particular group in that month. So it's telling you here you've got 10 people that need to be auto-enrolled, you've got 3 people where the contributions look too low. So it could be there's an issue with payroll, it hasn't calculated it correctly. You've got 5 where you need communications, and 2 employees that are not on the payroll that you're expecting to be there. So the obvious thing there would be that they've left. Okay. You then click on the show to basically break that down, and what it's showing you here is you've got 6 new eligible workers who need to be assessed and issue postponement notices, and you've got 4 where the postponement periods come to an end, so they need to be added to the scheme. You then click on the start, and it would go through and it gives you a list of the people and the national insurance numbers, and it automatically defaults to the correct communication that's built into the system. So in this particular case, these people need to be issued with a postponement notice, which again would be sitting within the back end of the system, and it would automatically default to those. You effectively go through, and if you agree with that, it will then say, how do you actually want to submit the communication? Now, in an ideal world, if you've got emails for everybody, which we'd strongly encourage if you can, and again, one of the RTI requirements is obviously to try and get emails where you can. Again, if you've got them, it's really useful because basically you just select email, and again, if there's an email address in the box, it'll automatically default to email. If there isn't an email address, you can either add it in, or essentially there's a print and post option that will produce paper versions and send them to your printer or your mailing house, depending upon what you're looking to achieve. Okay, so once you've done that, by pressing Submit Actions, that automatically would fire out the emails to those people so they receive them in their inbox straight away. So in terms of managing communications, it makes the whole process very simple. You're just electronically sending those communications. If not, you're sending them to a printer to print off and put in an envelope. Okay. So you'd work through all of those different actions, identify why contributions were too low, and you get to the end of that phase, and you'd be looking at all of your actions being complete. Now, month 1 aside, which is obviously going to be a busy period, we estimate this is probably going to take less than an hour if you're using this system to work through these actions, particularly if you've got the majority of your staff on email. So again, coming back to the point Kirsten made earlier in terms of time and efficiency savings, it does make life fairly easy. The other aspect of this, just quickly, is the reporting out of the back end. And essentially, there are a number of reports. There's a new joiner file that effectively you can send to your pension provider or upload into your pension provider's system. So whether it's Nest or the People's Pension or a commercial provider. You get a payroll file that tells you basically the changes that you need to make to payroll. And there's also an output file that can be used for any particular provider systems and things like that. So you can configure different reports. There's also quite rich reporting down the bottom as well, in terms of if you want to go in and run historic reports and look at the audit trail. So the system keeps an audit of all of your records, which is again one of the requirements of the legislation, is that you need to keep records for up to 6 years of all of the actions that have taken place, and obviously it does that for you. So that was a quick run through. As I say, it's more to show you the sort of functionality of some of these systems and how it can make your life a little bit easier. So we'll just sort of revert back to the presentation. Okay, thank you, John.
Back on presentation, excellent. Thank you very much for that, Martin. I hope that's given people a bit of an understanding of A, the steps involved, and B, the complexity of what we do. Sorry, we just lost the computer for a moment. We'll get there. That's fine. That's not. Excellent. Right. Sorry. So I hope that's given you an idea. I mean, I think the important thing to realise that this kind of software does, and coming back to Donna's question about what payroll maybe doesn't do, the certification is key. Payroll systems certainly won't do the certification, and making sure that you can get that covered off and calculated. It's not a simple thing to do because you have to look at the difference between your salary and qualifying earnings and so on. So it's a difficult thing. Having bespoke communication in there, you can tailor the communication yourselves and put your communication in there. But importantly, as Martin said, the system holds on to all that communication, so you've got your audit trail. And the diary and reminder system, reminding people that somebody's come to re-enrolment. We haven't really talked about re-enrolment today, but every 3 years, if somebody opts out, you've got to auto-enroll them. There aren't many payroll systems or systems generally that have a good approach to kind of a 3-year diary system. So something that does all of those things, I think, is pretty important. Okay, so let me just moving forward. We're coming towards the end of our discussions now, and we started off by asking you where you were in your process, and I think it's quite good to finish with a question about bit more about where you feel you are now. Do you think you've got a better understanding of auto-enrolment and feel a bit more confident about what you need to do and that you'll be ready for your staging date? Hopefully you understand a bit more about it now, but does the complexity mean that you're actually more worried about getting to your staging date, and or are you just more and more confused the more you find out about this and just need to go and lie down and forget about it? So perhaps you could just give us an idea of where you are in that process. Again, we've had a few questions coming in while we've been speaking. There's one question here about having scheme employer from Dashi about having employees who are in a standard stakeholder scheme and by salary sacrifice. The plan is to roll all eligible employees into the standard, but not using salary sacrifice. Is that acceptable? Martin, confusion of using salary sacrifice for some and some not?
Yeah, no, it certainly is acceptable to enrol people on a non-salary sacrifice basis. So that's certainly not an issue. Obviously, there is a cost impact of doing that because you don't save the national insurance contribution, so that's quite important to consider. However, just on the other side of that, you can't force people to be enrolled on a salary sacrifice basis. So if you are going to use salary sacrifice, you have to give them the option, if they don't want to be enrolled on a salary sacrifice basis, to be enrolled on a standard basis instead. So again, that's just something to be mindful of. There was also one other question that I saw came up, John, from Denise, which was talking about your staging date is, I believe, October 2013, and you've been told that you can postpone it until October 2017. I certainly don't think that's correct, so I'm not sure where that's come to you from, but please do send us an email afterwards and we'll be happy to sort of clarify that. But that's certainly not something that I'm aware of, and it's not something I think you can do. So please do follow up with a further question, and we'll be happy to answer that.
I would emphasise people, there's a lot of confusion. This is a very complicated area in the regulations, but the fines for not complying with auto-enrolment are quite high. Now, if you were to take that and find that wasn't the case, the fine would rack up very, very quickly. So make sure you're getting good quality advice from people who know what they're talking about this, and get legal advice if you've got any doubts whatsoever. We've now got the results of that poll here now, which is we've got a better understanding and feel more confident, 64%. So we're actually feeling quite pleased with ourselves here. So thank you for that vote of confidence. And to the couple of people that need to lie down, will be 2 minutes and you can go and have a lie down. So thank you for that. I think we've covered most of the questions. Any other questions we haven't covered? We're coming up to the end of the time, so we'll move on and finish up now, I think. Thank you for your time. Thanks for listening and for the questions. We probably have more questions here than we had in the other webinars. But do have a look at those other webinars if you'd like to find out a bit more. At the end of this, there will be a feedback form, and as I say, if you would like us to fill in to produce a project plan for you, or if you'd like to discuss the kind of questions you need to ask your payroll, then please do let us know. And we've got the email address there for you to contact us, or you can use the email addresses for myself and Martin, and phone numbers if you want to get in touch. We would be delighted to hear from you. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for keeping listening. I'm delighted to say that we've got the same number of participants at the end that we had at the start, which is also another great vote of confidence. So really appreciate it wherever you are in the world, and have a good afternoon or evening, depending on the time then. Thank you very much.